Name is Ani. I am 52 years old, and until recently I thought my life was well settled. My husband, Tony, a successful businessman, has devoted his life to work. Endless calls, meetings, contracts. It became his world. In 17 years of marriage, I learned to respect his dedication, but along with that came the quiet in our home. We decided we weren't going to have children. A medical diagnosis left me with no chance of becoming a mother, and I learned to live with that, though some nights the pervasive feeling of inferiority crowded out everything else. Tony said the two of us were enough, but sometimes I wasn't so sure. To keep myself occupied, I focused on my body. I meditated, stretched, spent hours at the gym. I tried to look as young and charming as I had in the early years of our life together. Tony noticed it, gave me expensive jewelry and clothes, but his gifts could not compensate for his absence. Morning breakfasts and occasional dinners together seemed like mere shards of something greater that we'd long since lost. That all changed when Lucas, Tony's son from his first marriage, moved in with us after graduating from college. He is 26 years old and literally the epitome of youth and courage. Tall, with piercing green eyes and strong arms, he was too attractive to go unnoticed. He and I quickly found a common language. He was interested in art, asked my opinion on interior design, told me about his plans. The attention I had missed so much from Tony, I began to get from Lucas. It was both amazing and unsettling. One night, as I was changing in my bedroom, I heard a knock on the door. Looking up, I saw Lucas standing on the doorstep. He was smiling, but there was a strange hesitation in his eyes. "I'm sorry if I'm interrupting, Ani," he said quietly, as if afraid he might upset the delicate balance. "It's okay," I replied, pulling my robe over me. But my voice shook, and so did my hands. I felt his gaze on me, too intense, too attentive. "Just wanted to say, thanks for dinner," he added, but there was more to his words. Lucas hesitated, but stepped into the room nonetheless. His proximity was frighteningly scalding. He sat on the edge of the chair, looking at me, and I at him, as if the room had gotten too thin. His voice was soft as he talked about his life, about how hard it was to find himself after college. But there was something in his words and his gaze that went beyond casual conversation. I didn't know how much time we spent like that, sitting across from each other and trying not to destroy this fragile line that had suddenly appeared between us. And then he stood up, came closer, and without a word, touched my cheek. "Ani, you're amazing," he said softly, his voice barely audible but insistent. That night, when my husband's footsteps echoed in the hallway, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Lucas recoiled instantly, cleverly hiding his emotions. I backed away hastily, trying to look as natural as possible. Tension hung in the air like a thin thread ready to break. My husband glanced at us, his gaze not giving away a shadow of suspicion. But inside me, everything was turning upside down. After that incident, my meetings with Lucas became even more cautious, almost painfully secretive. We avoided each other in my husband's presence, as if we were afraid that one wrong spark would give away the fire that raged inside both of us. But left alone, that fire would burst out. Every stolen moment was saturated with a passion that made me dizzy, like forbidden wine. For the first time in years, I felt heard. Lucas was like an antique mirror that reflected not only my outward appearance, but my soul as well. I told him things I'd never dared to say out loud, about my emptiness that was slowly eating me from the inside out, about the frustration of a marriage where every day had become a chore. I confessed the fears I hid even from myself. Lucas listened carefully, without judgment, as if my words were more important to him than anything else in the world. His eyes radiated such warmth that I felt like I could drown in it. That night, when he ran his hand gently through my hair, the whole world disappeared. It was just us, but every time I gave into that connection, there was a struggle inside. Moral barriers fell like a house of cards under the force of emotion. I knew it was wrong. I knew I risked losing everything, but with every kiss, every stolen moment, the passion grew stronger. Lucas was my refuge and my curse at the same time. We met in the most unexpected places. In an empty park under the cover of night, in the backseat of his car, in the small rental apartment he rented for work. Each time, I told myself it would be the last time. But then his hands would find me, his lips would touch mine, and I would lose control. One day I felt like it couldn't go on forever. Lucas looked at me as we sat in a small cafe over a cup of coffee. His gaze was intense, his eyes searching mine, like he was trying to see into the very depths of my soul. "We can't live like this," he whispered, his voice both firm and trembling. "You have to make a choice." I froze. His words were like a knife. I knew he was right. This triangle was strangling us both. But choose? How? Leave a husband to whom I was bound by years of habits and commitments? Or cut ties with Lucas, who had become my heir? When I got home, my husband was already asleep. I quietly walked into the bedroom, trying to deal with the storm of emotions. I stood at the window in the darkness, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city. Everything around me seemed so quiet, but inside me was chaos. I knew I was going to ruin someone's life, maybe my own. But the thought of no longer feeling Lucas's warm touch, his gentle words in my ear, was unbearable. The man had woken me up, made me feel alive. I couldn't go back to the grayness of my old life anymore. Lying in the darkness, I listened to the measured breathing of my husband beside me. His stillness was both soothing and frightening. It seemed as if he could wake up at any moment, as if he sensed my inner turmoil. Unable to lie awake any longer, I quietly climbed out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. The cold floor beneath my bare feet awakened me completely. I grabbed a glass and was pouring water when I heard light footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Lucas. His face was barely illuminated by the moonlight falling from the window, but there was so much warmth and tenderness in his eyes that I froze in place. "You can't sleep either?" I whispered, trying to keep my distance, but my voice trembled. Lucas silently stepped closer. His hands found my waist, and he pulled me against him. The hug was so tight that I felt small, vulnerable. His face was so close to mine that I could hear his ragged breathing. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered in my ear. "You've become everything to me. I don't know how to deal with that." His lips slid down my neck, leaving hot trails. I tried to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, my arms wrapped around his shoulders on their own, as if it was natural, as if I belonged to him. "You don't realize how much I've come to love you," he continued, whispering the words into my skin. "You've changed my life. Every moment with you is like a breath of fresh air after a long suffocation." His words pierced through the armor of my mind, and I felt my resistance melt away. We stood there, absorbed in each other, as if the whole world had ceased to exist. His lips found mine, but I turned away just in time, my heart pounding like crazy. He looked at me, his eyes flitting between passion and understanding. He took a step back, as if to give me space, but his gaze stayed fixed on my face. "I know it's wrong," he said, "but you feel the same way, don't you?" I shook my head silently, not trusting my voice. The only thing I wanted to do at that moment was run away. I brushed past him, leaving him standing in the darkness of the kitchen, and hurried back to the bedroom. Back in bed, I lay next to my husband, who was still sleeping peacefully. But chaos raged inside me. His face, his touch, his words, all of it wouldn't let me go. It was a moment of truth. I could no longer live on two fronts. This double life was destroying me. Lucas needed more than I could give him in this situation, and he deserved more. But could I leave the husband who had been by my side for so many years? Could I destroy my family to be happy? I lay in the dark and listened to my heartbeat. A decision was looming, but the fear of it was holding me back. I knew now that a choice had to be made, and that choice would change everything. The next morning, I went to my husband and told him we needed to talk. As usual, he was deep in his papers, not paying much attention to me. I started to speak, feeling my voice shaking, but continued, knowing there was no turning back. His reaction was cold, almost indifferent. Perhaps he'd known for a long time himself, but he just didn't want to admit it. I was sitting in the living room when the phone rang. My husband stood up abruptly, casting a warm glance at me, and answered it. His face immediately tensed, and after a brief conversation, he silently gathered himself and left. I knew what it meant. Another call to work, after hours as always. His life was so crowded with things to do that I often felt like one of those things he kept on the periphery. When the door closed behind him, I was left alone in the oppressive silence. A storm was raging inside me. I stared at my reflection in the glass of the window, and it felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. Lucas had come into my life like a spark that reawakened long-dead feelings. But that spark could burn everything to the ground. I stood up and slowly made my way to his room. The door was ajar, and I saw him sitting with his hand on his head, staring pensively into the void. His eyes, so earnest, looked straight into my soul when I entered. We both knew this conversation was inevitable. "Lucas," I started quietly, but my voice trembled. He stood up, walked over to me, and hugged me so tightly that I felt like I was disappearing into his arms. At that moment, I could have drowned in his warmth, forgotten everything around us. His lips softly touched my forehead, then my neck. He whispered, "I never meant for things to go this far, but I can't stop loving you." Those words tore me apart. His confessions were both warm and scalding at the same time. Everything inside me screamed, "Stop," but my body betrayed my mind. I responded to his kiss, deep and desperate, as if it were the last time. And it was. It was goodbye. As I struggled to pull away from him, I felt tears come to my throat. "I can't," I whispered. "It's not right. Not for me, not for you, not for him." He pulled back, but there was no reproach in his gaze. Only pain and understanding. "No, I'll always be here if you ever want to come back." The words sounded like a promise, but I knew I would never return. The love he offered was bright but devastating. When I got back to my bedroom, the world was cold and empty again. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to collect my thoughts. Long minutes passed before I realized I had come to a decision. It wasn't a choice between two men. It's a choice between honor and betrayal, between duty and desire. Several days passed, and I waited for the right time to speak to my husband. But fate intervened. One evening he came home earlier than usual. I sat on the couch holding a book to hide my confusion. His eyes met mine, and in that look I saw love, fatigue, and something else, uncertainty. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I could feel the guilt slamming into my head. Unable to find the words, I just smiled, avoiding his gaze. As the weeks passed, I realized more and more that the connection with Lucas was not only forbidden, but destructive to both of us. It was like a fire that I'd started myself but couldn't put out. Every day I realized more and more clearly that I had to let go of both him and this illusion. One night, I wrote Lucas a letter explaining everything. I thanked him for showing me what I was missing, but I also asked him to let me go. That letter became my point of reference. I left it on his doorstep and walked away without looking back. This chapter of my life became a painful lesson. I realized that true intimacy is not built on passion and secrets, but on honesty, respect, and deep mutual understanding. My marriage was far from perfect, but now I was ready to fight for it, not run away. The past had left its scars on me, but it had also made me stronger. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward instead of running away from myself.